Hi, this is Paul Anderson, and today's podcast is going to be a little different than the other ones. This is actually a lecture that I gave when I was in San Diego recently at a bar camp. If you're not familiar with that, you can always Google it. But today I want to tell the story of changes that have taken place at our school over the last year. So I teach at Bozeman High School in Bozeman, Montana. It's a gorgeous place to teach and a gorgeous place to live. I just went for a ski today, and I love it. But like any school, we're plagued with kids who drop out, kids who are uninterested in school, kids who hate homework. And so over the last year, we've tried to improve our schools, and we've improved our schools using Costanza's rule of opposite. If you're not familiar with Costanza's rule of opposite, it comes from a famous Seinfeld episode. It's an episode where George Costanza, who's pictured here, decides that every decision he's made his whole life has been the wrong decision. And therefore, the opposite of every decision he's made would be the right choice. And so he's meeting this girl, and he says, "Hello, I'm George. I live at home with my parents. I'm unemployed." And the girl is, well, that's very exciting. So pretty soon his life kind of falls into place, and he gets a job with the Yankees, and so it's kind of a cool story. And so what we've tried to do is to apply Costanza's rules of opposites to the following four things at our school to hopefully improve them. The first one is the idea of professional development. In other words, teachers usually hate getting trained on using technology, and it just doesn't work in schools. And so we've kind of taken a different slant on that. Another thing is homework. In my classroom, homework was something that kids dreaded. A lot of them resisted it, and I ended up failing a lot of kids who just didn't do their homework, which is not a good thing. Next thing, we have kids coming through our schools that are digital natives. In other words, they've grown up using technology, except when they come to school, they have to check all of that at the door. And so how do we kind of get around that as a school? And then the last thing, I'm going to talk about teaching and how I've used technology to improve my teaching over the last year. And you're probably familiar with some of the things that I've done. So we've come up with four ideas, and I think that they are not only ideas, but they're things that worked. In other words, I'm not going to talk about anything that didn't work or we haven't tried out. And so the first thing is this idea of secret meetings. It helped as far as professional development at our school, and it's kind of caught fire. Next is the idea of a blended classroom. A blended classroom is when you have your normal classroom, and you teach that fairly normally, but then you have an online component to your classroom, and I use Moodle at my school. Next is the idea of making our campus more tech-friendly for kids, a place where they can feel comfortable using technology. And then the last thing is this idea that as a teacher, you have an obligation to create things and then share them with everyone else. And if you do that, it's this wonderful loop where you start to get feedback. And so the first thing dealt with the problem of professional development. We would constantly try to teach teachers how to use new things, and they would resist it because they weren't really invested in it. I would lots of times talk to teachers, and they would say, "That's really neat. Could you give us some training on it? I would love to use that." And usually what that meant is it was a polite way of them saying, "I'm not really interested in that. I don't have a passion about that." And so what we started was something called Tech Junkies, and we would meet in the library. It started with just 3 of us, and we'd meet in the library every Thursday, and we talk about technology and how technology could be used to improve schools. And those 3 people grew to 5 people and 7 people, and the only rules were that you couldn't come to the meetings unless you asked us if you could come to the meetings. And so by making it optional, and then it kind of made it more desirable. A great story somebody told me about this is this idea when he was growing up. His parents would never put vegetables on his plate. They would always just put vegetables on their own plate. And when he asked them as a kid what the vegetables were for, they would always say, "Oh, those are something that the parents just use." And so it made him want vegetables. So it's kind of counterintuitive. Anyway, next one is this idea of the homework arms race. And this came to me one time when I was thinking about, why do kids hate homework? And I think it's this idea, an arms race where we say, you need to read Lord of the Flies. And so we say, read Lord of the Flies, and say, So most of the kids do, but some say, I don't want to read Lord of the Flies. And so then we say, well, we're going to give you a quiz on that. And they say, well, I'm going to use Cliff Notes because I don't want to have to take that. And so then we make it a harder quiz, and then they watch the movie, and then we make it harder tests, and then they cheat, or they get Spark Notes or something like that. And really what we want kids to do is they want to use their natural inclination to learn. I think everybody wants to learn. And so what I developed in my classroom is this idea of a blended classroom. In other words, I created in my classroom all of these different types of homework, and then I make it optional as far as which ones they want to use, because people learn in different ways. And so somebody who can just read the book and understand the material shouldn't have to do tons of worksheets or watch videos or whatever. They should just do that. Whereas if somebody really gets help out of those, then they should have that option. So we use something called Moodle, and let me show you what that looks like a little bit. If we were to do a unit on molecular genetics, I would have all these different things, all these different options that they could use, and it goes much farther than this, for homework. And so they get different points based on how much they do, or they could do none at all. And so by making homework optional, it makes it almost mandatory. In other words, kids show up at Moodle all the time because they see it as an advantage over other students, and so they're spending a lot of time there studying. And if you're watching this podcast, you may be one of those students that just kind of goes out of your way to learn new material. Next is the idea of how do we deal with digital natives? In other words, how do we deal with kids who've grown up their whole life using technology? Well, what we did at our school is we started by surveying them. And here's some of the stuff we found out. Number one, we found that 96% of the kids in our district have internet at home. And it was something like 94% of it is high-speed internet. And so if we as a school were just to ignore this, the fact that kids have internet at home, we'd be missing out on a huge thing. Next, we asked kids, what kind of controls do you have at home? Do you have little or no parental controls of what you can do on the internet? Do you have moderate controls of what you can do, or do you have very strict controls? And what we found at home is that kids really have little structure as far as what they can do on the internet. And so I think schools were starting to realize that maybe we have to provide some of that at the school. And then the next thing we looked at was how many of you actually have technology in your pocket. At our school, it used to be banned. In other words, you couldn't bring cell phones to school, you couldn't have iPods, you couldn't have laptops, you couldn't have any of that. And that's how most high schools are. And what we found is that 64% of them have some kind of a iPod Touch, iPhone thing that they just have in their pocket. And so if we were to ignore that at the school, we'd be ignoring a huge resource. And so what we did is we changed our electronic use policy, and we've opened it up, and we're starting to open that up in the classroom. And so what we can do is we can tap into some of those things. In other words, if we were to just close down all this technology and not offer it, kids are going to start to resent that. So we've kind of taken the Costanza rule as far as that goes. And then the last thing that I've realized, especially in my classroom, is that classrooms normally are thought of as something that's closed off. In other words, as an instructor, you teach the kids in your classroom, and that's it. You're done with those 30 kids. But what I realized, and you're probably familiar with this if you watch my podcast, is that you can put that on the internet when you're done. And so I started producing these podcasts for my classes, and then I realized, hey, I could just throw this up on the internet. And so I started this channel, Bozeman Biology, and I get, sometimes it'll be 1,000 views a day, which to me is just weird, because I'm teaching less than 100 kids during the day, but I'm teaching 1,000 throughout the rest of the day, throughout the rest of the world. We also started something called the Bold Standard, and that's it's a website, and what I'm trying to do, and that's what I'm working on right now, is having some kind of a Moodle on there. And so kids who are out on the internet who don't have access to something like the Moodle class in my classroom maybe can create one and share it on their own. So that's something I'm working on right now. And so in closing today, I wanted to talk a little bit about Wikipedia and what lesson that has for us. When I grew up, we had something called the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was a stack of, like 25 books. And inside there you had a lot of information, but it was really expensive and not very accessible. You had to look through each book to find topics. That was replaced by an electronic encyclopedia called Encarta, which was much cheaper. It had videos, but when that was introduced, people who were Encyclopedia Britannica salesmen lost their job, but all of us did better. Now, Encarta was replaced by something called Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a free encyclopedia that's produced by everybody who's interested in producing it. That made Encarta go out of business, but our world has gotten better. And so I think schools are going to be faced with a similar thing in the future. In other words, a lot of this learning is going to be accessible for free, and so I think schools have to learn to adapt and learn to get ready for that change. And if we don't, we're just going to be a bunch of Encyclopedia Britannica salesmen out of work. Thanks for